Since yesterday, definitely the situation started to feel a lot more tense, a lot more real. I think we felt, even though a lot of things were happening in Italy, we were a little bit removed from it, being so far south in Rome. But people have almost instantly started listening to the regulations. So people are definitely limiting their travel outside of their homes. We're staying home a lot more. One person is doing the shopping. And so the only thing you really see that's different is the number of people allowed into any public space is very limited. So even though the coffee bars are open, they have taped out meter apart spaces where you're allowed to stand. Or if you try to go to the supermarket, you do see lines, and it's not because people are making a run on the food, but it's because they're really limiting how many people are allowed to go into the supermarket at a time. So everyone is standing 1 meter apart, so more than 3 feet apart when they're inside the store, but also outside of the store, you'll see these lines starting. In Rome right now, honestly, the only thing that we're out of is masks and hand sanitizer. And even the hand sanitizer I've seen come back on the market in the last few days. And so the strange thing is that a lot of the businesses are closing very early. So if you're not an essential business, you have to close by 6 p.m. And this is really being enforced. So that means meeting your friends for an aperitivo, meeting your friends for a happy hour. That's not happening anymore. So I think that's more of an impact than any kind of shortage on goods. You can go to the pharmacies. The pharmacies are operating as normal. They're fully stocked, except for masks. But it is a little bit jarring when you step into a pharmacy to see the pharmacist wearing a mask, because that wasn't really happening until the new restrictions came in. Yeah, it's really strange to see Rome this empty. I think the only thing we can even marginally compare it to is that in mid-August, Italians usually take their vacation around this holiday called Ferragosto. So by August 15th, the city clears out of Romans, but not of visitors. So there's still people around, but it feels quieter. And now it's cleared out of everyone. There are no Romans walking around. There are definitely no visitors. And you can feel this. I'm really curious. I would love to go see some of the sites right now, like the Trevi Fountain with no people. The Colosseum is closed, but to be able to walk around it with absolutely no crowds would be really interesting. But it's not something we're doing because we've been told to really just stay home except for essential reasons. So what I would say is when this was announced, I got lots of concerned messages from friends and family in the U.S., and I completely understand the concern because it is very scary to hear about a country being in lockdown. And I don't want to underplay the severity of the situation. The reason that the government has enacted these measures is because it is a very serious situation. But we are not under martial law. We do not need government permission to leave our homes. And so really what this is we were being asked very strongly just to stay home, to do social distancing. But you are allowed to leave. You're allowed to leave to go grocery shopping. You're allowed to leave even to go to work. But most companies are allowing teleworking at this point. And you're even allowed to go for a walk outside. But you can't meet people when you do that. So you can go for a walk by yourself. You can still go get fresh air. But really, the issue is social distancing, staying away from other people as much as possible.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.